Interlude. Sage. 84th of Sidra, 346 AG, Belhazi Weld. Saginius Lynx, or Sage as his friends called him, took a sip of his crag and gently placed it on the desk he sat at. The elf reached up and rubbed the shining streak of silver hair that had accumulated at his temples. The streak was a fine contrast to the blue-hued head of hair he already had. In the lives he had lived throughout the scope of his existence, he had never once allowed his hair to silver, but this time he decided to try it out. He had found that he didn't entirely hate the look either. A blue and silver beard had grown over the elf's generally smooth, fair-skinned face. It had been weeks since he had first sat down at his desk to wage a digital war against the Empire. The war was a personal one he had been planning for centuries. They had ruined everything he worked and fought so hard to build and defend in the Age of Ancients. He briefly thought over the perversion of the Nane and the grotesque repurposing of the Afterscape, and couldn't help but suck on his two front teeth in frustration. A reckoning was on the horizon, and he knew his actions were going to be the catalyst of it all. Sage stank. He sat in his chair wearing only a pair of white cotton pajama bottoms and his favorite pair of fur-lined slippers. Lucas had acquired the slippers and given them to Sage for his birthday. He rather enjoyed them. The fur was soft on his feet and the cushioned soles never lost their springiness, no matter how much Sage wore them. He reached forward, taking hold of the glass of crag before him. He lifted it to eye level and gave it a shake, watching the bubbles in the green liquid rise to the top. He took a drink and set the carbonated citrusy beverage down and then reached his arm into the air, stretching his muscles.
"Dad!"
an impatient voice shouted.
"Dad, we have to go!"
"I know, son," Sage replied. He sighed and turned to face Lucas. His eyes glanced upon the boy, and he couldn't help but smile. Lucas was 16 years old. He stood only a few inches shorter than Sage and had a head of wavy dark brown hair, a quality he had inherited from his mother. A look of anxiety was spread across his face, and Sage smiled. "I should say, my son," Sage chuckled as he rose to his feet, "a few Govian soldiers is nothing to worry about. Do you have faith in your training? Do you have faith in me?"
"Dad,
Lucas stumbled over his words.
"I've never fought anyone before."
"Oh, but you have," Sage said, stepping forward. "Treat this as a training session, and remember, your power far outweighs theirs. If you stay calm, if you remain in control of the situation, nothing will happen to you. Come." Sage waved Lucas over as he began walking toward the exit of the structure they were in. Lucas stood in place, pondering over his father's words for a moment.
"But, Dad, you don't have a shirt on!"
Lucas called out as he hurried after him.
"And is your Nane fully charged? Do you have your shields up? And are you attuned to the temporal paths? Shouldn't you—"
"I am always prepared, my boy. Forget the shirt. Modesty has no bearing on the outcome of battles, young one," Sage called back, flicking his wrist in dismissal of his boy's words. "Besides, I should say it is a lovely day outside." Sage stopped before the door that led out. He turned his head 90 degrees so that he could just see Lucas behind him. "You are ready," Sage confidently and calmly informed him. Lucas took a breath and nodded. He reached his hands out and crackling electricity enveloped them. The boy guided the power up his arms and stopped it at his shoulders, and then willed it away. Sage watched this and smiled, briefly swollen with pride for the boy. The smile faded, and then his gaze fell for a moment as he considered the reality of his situation. "Anyway," Sage forced himself to say, "it is time we begin, is it not?" Sage pushed the door open and stepped outside. The brothers shone overhead and gently pierced the canopy of the Belhazi Weld. Their light flecked the ground, illuminating the life that rot and decay had sprung up in 1,000 years' time. Massive roots wove through the surface, leaves blanketed the ground, and tall, unmolested trees, thick from a millennium of life, stretched toward the sky. Sage saw the remnants of buildings around him, overgrown with vines and teeming with life. Whether it was a hive of onion beetles feeding on the vegetation, a clan of apes carving out their homes in the overgrown rooms of the old buildings, or any number of bird, rodent, or reptile, the Belhazi Weld was both host to thriving life and reaper of abundant death.
"Good morning,"
Sage declared as he stepped out onto what had once been considered a sidewalk. It was now a rich forest soil seasoned with leaves and stones. Sage held out his arms in welcome to his guests, the couple dozen armed Govian soldiers who stood before his building.
"'Tis a beautiful day. I should say a perfect one for company. Welcome, welcome, harbingers of the Emperor's grace. However may I be of service to you on this fine day?"
"Get on your knees,"
the leader of the Govians ordered.
"Hands on your head. You're under arrest."
The Govian, decked out in navy blue clothing and black combat armor, was difficult to hear from Sage's position due to the voice modulation hardware in his equipment. Sage cocked his head and took a step forward, turning his ear toward the Govian.
"1,000 apologies, Your Eminence," Sage called out to him, "but I should say I am having a bit of trouble hearing you. Can you turn your microphone up just a smidge?"
Silently, the Govian reached up and turned a dial on the side of his helmet.
"On your knees!"
he shouted, this time his voice much louder.
"Hands on your head! You're under arrest!"
"Oh, that is very good."
Sage smiled warmly, waving a finger toward the Govian.
"Yes, I can hear you fine now."
Sage paused and looked over at Lucas, nodding his head.
"We would be wise to follow their commands,"
he said with a wink. Lucas couldn't help the grin that formed on his face. He had never seen his father fight for real before. It had always been in training up to that point. The subtle confidence and irreverence of his father, however, led Lucas to believe he was in for a show. Obediently, Sage Lynx raised his hands into the air. He slowly lowered to his knees and gently placed his palms against the back of his head. "Follow my lead," Sage said so that only the two of them could hear. He didn't move his head as he stared out at the couple dozen rifle barrels being pointed toward him and his son. "I will save 6 for you. On my mark. Phase." Lucas mimicked his father's actions, lowering himself to his knees and placing his hands on his head as well. The Govian in charge motioned for his people to advance and detain Sage and Lucas. Sage watched them step forward and waited. He formulated his battle plan and focused to a point where the soldiers' movement seemed too slow. He considered what he wanted to eat for dinner that night, and then remembered he had a load of laundry in the wash. He winced, realizing that due to the time dilation effect of his home, the wet clothes were probably already stinking of mildew. Oops, he missed his mark.
"Go,"
he called back, and then, before the Govians could react or perceive what had happened, Sage and Lucas had vanished.
"Shit!"
the Govian leader called out.
"They're phasing! Klaus should have sent Reapers! Find them! Kill them!"
Sage reappeared behind the Govians, and his previously naked hands and forearms were glowing brightly from the light of the 3-foot pillars of fire that he wielded. He darted forward, immediately bisecting one of the Govians with his power. Gunfire erupted, and Sage phased again, reappearing behind 2 of them and quickly thrusting his pillars through their backs and out their chests. Before they could even fall, Sage rocketed backward and hacked his fire downward, cutting through the heads and into the chest of 2 more. Lucas finally reappeared and awkwardly staggered in place for a moment. One of the Govians spotted him and swung his rifle in the boy's direction. Lucas yipped and threw his palm forward. A chain of lightning leapt from Lucas and passed into the chest of the soldier, blasting him backwards. Lucas gasped and grinned, feeling a rush from his first kill. He reached down and pulled a basket-hilted sword from its scabbard at his hip. At his command, electricity pulsed down the metal of the blade, leaving Lucas grinning wildly. Sage appeared in front of Lucas and waggled a finger at him.
"Stop staring at your sword!"
he snapped, and then swatted the boy in the side of the head.
"Focus!"
At that, Sage phased again and reappeared just in time to drive one of his pillars up through the bottom of a Govian's chin. The fight lasted a little over a minute and a half. Lucas got shot once, Sage killed nearly 20 soldiers, and then Lucas finished off the rest. At the end, Sage stood surrounded by bodies and held the captain of the Govian squad in the air by his throat.
Please!
The captain begged. He held onto Sage's wrist with both hands, squeezing with all his might as his feet kicked and thrashed through the air.
Let me go!
Sage stared at the captain and contemplated his request. The skin of the person's neck was cooking, searing where Sage gripped him. Okay, Sage said, lowering the Govian to the ground. Go on, then.
What?
The captain rasped.
What do you mean?
You asked to be freed. Sage tilted his head in confusion. I should say I can't think of a more appropriate action than this. The Govian stared dumbfounded at Sage, his face growing red with frustration and embarrassment. Sage peered into his eyes and took a step closer, knowing full well he was dominating the captain at that moment. You better go back to where you came from, Sage softly suggested. Waiting here will do you no good, unless, of course, you wish to join us. The Govian didn't respond. Sage reached out, gently dusting off the Govian's right shoulder, and took hold of the straps that held his armor in place. He tisked and shook his head. Just look at you. I should say you need to wear this cuirass a smidge tighter next time. The last thing you want in combat is for your armor to be falling off like this. Here. Sage reached down to the captain's sides and tugged on the belts that held his armor in place. Just a bit more. Bear with me. Probably don't move. Lucas winked at the captain as he finally approached. You don't want to spook him. He's known to react badly to being spooked. And done, Sage declared as he reached up and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. Battle ready, good for you. You should never let comfort trump safety. At that, he reached his hand out and gave the Govian a playful slap on the side of the helmet. Now, off with you. Time for you to get home where you can be safe and lazy. Safe travels. Sage stepped aside and gestured for the Govian to be on his way. The captain took a few uneasy steps, which turned into a brisk walk. As he reached the tree line, however, he stopped. Clenching his fists, he turned around and pointed at Sage and Lucas.
This isn't over, Ancient!
The captain barked at them.
I'll be back, and you better bet you won't survive our next encounter. Neither you nor the boy.
Sage did not reply. He simply smiled and raised his hand in a wave. The Govian huffed and shook his head at the elf. Finally, he turned around to run, only to find himself staring into the blue eyes of Saginius Lynx. I should say it is bad form to threaten the child of the one who spared your life. Sage reached up, hooked his fingers around the left side of the Govian's face, and placed his other hand on the back of his head. Without another word, he twisted the Govian's head 180 degrees. A loud cracking followed, and the captain fell to the ground. That one was cool, Lucas said, referring to the move Sage had used to snap the Govian's neck. Teach me that one next. Maybe, Sage replied with a sigh. Poor fellow had to have the last word. A sure sign of a small cock, son. Yelling and threatening always suggest a person is compensating for something else. I know you aren't the most endowed person either. Please try to compensate in other ways. Maybe learn how to draw flowers. Well, that was... Lucas shook his head and sighed. Wholly unnecessary. Sage snorted and got to his feet. Time to get back to Site 2. Sage sighed, looking back at the building he and Lucas had left. Site 49 is compromised. He pursed his lips together and nodded at Site 49. You were a good office. He slipped his hand into one of the pockets of his pajama pants and pulled out a small cylindrical object. He twisted off the top of a cylinder, revealing a red button, and a tinny voice played through a speaker at the bottom. Voice authorization required. Awaiting password input. Calamitous 33725, Sage replied. Password accepted. Device is armed. Sage looked at Lucas and the boy nodded his head. Have you ever witnessed the self-destruction of a site before? I've spent literally every minute I've been in this world with you, Lucas replied flatly. Oh, no then, Sage smiled. Well, prepare to be amazed in 3, 2, 1. Sage pressed the button with his thumb and the building quivered slightly. Lucas tilted his head, expecting a bit more than a shake, and chuckled. "Keep watching," Sage instructed. The building trembled once more, and then in the blink of an eye it collapsed in on itself, as if being sucked into a vacuum. The building was there one moment, and then it wasn't. All that remained behind was a large gray oblong spheroid on the ground. Sage raised the device to his mouth and said, "Rexus 37229. The device replied with a beep, and then Sage replaced the cap. "That's it?" Lucas asked. He looked up at his father with a disappointed look on his face. "I was hoping for an explosion or something." "One should never hope for an explosion," Sage replied. He turned on his heel and patted the boy on the top of the head. "Come, Lucas, time for us to get to Site 2. You need to return to the Expanse, and I have much work to do."